Hello, everyone. Well, today we're taking a look at Ephesians 5, verses 15 through 21, aren't we? The subject Paul treats in this short paragraph is life in the Spirit, and this section is just a further development of what it means to live a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. That's chapter 4 and verse 1. It's just a continuation or an explanation of that verse. First of all, in our text for today, Paul encourages us to use time well, doesn't he? Verses 15 through 17. To make the most of every opportunity. And isn't that something we all need to be reminded of? The present opportunity to live the Christian life and do the work of the Lord might not last much longer, so we need to use the present opportunities to the full while we can. But as he says in verse 17, in order to seize opportunities to do the work and will of God, we must what? We must understand what that will is. So, verse 17. Then, Paul writes, "Don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit." Replace a certain kind of spirits with a different spirit, the Spirit of God. And of course, well, this is a call to live in unity with God, to be in a place where the presence and power of God are evident. What does life in the Spirit or life in the wholeness of God look like? Well, Paul will say in verse 19 it's characterized by singing. He will use three participles to talk about what life in the Spirit looks like in verse 19. Singing is the natural expression of joy that God brings into a person's life, right? By the way, this letter would have been read in an assembly of the church, and likely the singing that Paul has in mind here would have taken place there in that worship assembly. And he writes in this passage that the heartstrings should be plucked, whereas in Old Testament days the strings of a lyre or a harp would have been plucked. Paul sort of takes that passage or those passages from the Old Testament. He says, now I want you to pluck your heartstrings. In other words, worship should be heartfelt. And singing to one another from the heart is evidence of the presence of the Spirit. In addition to singing, life in the Spirit is characterized by giving thanks. Verse 20. My feeling is that many Christians need to hear this, that many Christians lack appreciation of the importance of thanksgiving in the New Testament. We are to give thanks for everything in the name of Jesus, and there are so many references in the New Testament to being thankful. Well, that again is an evidence that we are full of the Spirit or full of God in our lives. And finally, the last participle that describes life in the Spirit in this passage is found in verse 21, and it may be the most surprising, for Paul writes that we are to submit to one another out of reverence or fear or respect for Christ. All Christians are to submit to each other, to see the worth in one another, to defer to respect, to love one another. And isn't this really what Christianity is all about? In a nutshell, submission. Submission to God, submission to Christ, submission to one another. When I think about submitting to one another, I think about Jesus, who at that last Passover supper with his disciples wrapped a towel around his waist and washed his disciples' feet. Submit to one another. That's challenging. Now, next, chapter 5, verses 22 through chapter 6 and verse 9, we're going to take a look at the Christian household. It'll be challenging, won't it? I'll see you in a few days.